it's between 4 and 6 p.m. At that location. So that I know that only applies to some of you, but if you're interested, and I know we would love to. If you're interested and live here in Salt Lake City, we would love to see you then. And we're planning on doing if that is something that people like are excited about coming to, we'll probably continue to do a mix of remote talks that are virtual and live streamed, and kind of intersperse that some months with an in-person networking kind of gathering. So check that out if you have there. We use, this is a professional and friendly space, and we use the R Consortium's Code of Conduct, so you can check that out here. So Ijamaka is going to be speaking, and then Andrew and I will be moderating. So even though we are not in person together, but rather here online, we want to treat each other with the professionalism and respect that makes our community great. You can check that out. Speaking of the R Consortium, they are one of our sponsors, and they sent me an email saying, hey, do the people who attend your things know that we put out information on our various social channels? So I am just going to real briefly drop the links for the R Consortium's social channels, and if you are on any of those platforms, you can follow the R Consortium there to hear more about what they do. We're really thankful for the R Consortium's sponsorship. For example, the meetup page that we don't have to pay for, or because they do it, and all that kind of thing. So we're really thankful for them. If you are interested in giving a talk, we would love to hear from you. Getting into late fall or early next spring, there's two kinds of ways you can think about doing that. One of them is that we do lightning talks. The first meeting of the year. So that'll be like January or February. So that'll be like, 7 minutes or so, 5 to 7 minutes of like a really brief talk about something you've worked on. So keep that in mind if you are wanting to do that. And then we would love, if you have like a longer kind of talk that you are interested in doing, we would love to hear from you. So you can reach out to me or Andrew or Mark Nielsen, our other organizer, to talk about that. All right, I think that's all the announcements. Yeah? Yeah, I think it is. So I am really happy to be introducing our speaker today. Ijamaka is not local here to Salt Lake City, so we're really lucky to be able to have her speaking. So Ijamaka Anyene Fumagali works in healthcare as a data analyst, and in her free time, because we all have so much, is a computational artist. And I've been so impressed with Ijamaka's both, I guess, like taste and perspective, and also her like computational chops. And so I'm really happy about her being able to talk about generative art, creating generative art systems, and being able to build community around creating art together. So Ijamaka, thank you so much for being here. Let's see if you can get unmuted and share your screen. As she does that, so you are very welcome to type in questions as we go, and we can bring those to Ijamaka's attention if they're relative to what we're saying right now, or there will be time for questions at the end as well. So please feel free to drop anything in the chat there. So thank you so much, Ijamaka.
Yeah, happy to be here. Really excited to give this talk. I think this is the first time I'm actually giving like a generative art talk, so it'll be fun. Thanks everyone for having me. Thanks to Julia for that great introduction. I'm going to be talking about the anatomy of generative art. And so about me, some things I've done as an artist. So I'm actually like a data analyst, like a healthcare data analyst, I think is like the best way to define it. But as like an artist, I've created an R stats scene exploring radio computational art. I also really love fruit-based generative art. I leave it and then I come back to it because it's just so much fun. But right now I'm really exploring a lot of things that are grid-based and minimal and geometric, and you're gonna see a lot of those elements and what we talk about today. But before I kick off, like talking about generative art, I really want to plug this resource, Art from Code by Danielle Navarro, which is a workshop that she did for the R Studio conference last month. And it's like, right now, I think it's probably the best resource on generative art in R. It's both very comprehensive and she provides a ton of code. And so if you're really interested in generative art post this talk and you want to learn more, I really recommend checking out this resource. All right, cool. So what is generative art? And sorry, hang on one second. Yeah, so what is generative art? So whenever people ask me, I really struggle to come up with like a really great quote for a really great explanation, but very luckily, there's been tons of writing and scholarship about this topic. And so I really like this quote from Charlotte Kent from an article that she wrote called Beyond the Janus-Face Typologies of Art and Technology. And she described generative art as art that operates within a rule structure, but has an element of chance that is crucial to what many artists enjoy about it. The final work is partly produced by an autonomous system, which may be strictly regulated by the rules or operate within parameters. And so lots of words in this quote, but like the three key things really are that there's a rule structure, it involves element of chance, and it's produced by an autonomous system. And when I like to think through complicated things, because I started in operations, I really love a flowchart. And so you have your generative art, and then you have the autonomous system. So very often the autonomous system is like whatever is the programming language you use. Mine's often R. Your rule structures, what are you trying to say should be in an output? What are you trying to create? And then the element of chance, which is like a really vague term and it encompasses a ton of things, but like some of the things that it most commonly encompasses is like randomness. So of course, chance, randomness, noise, which I'll talk more about later. There's probability functions and trigonometry. Then it also encompasses just like more math, which is the best way for me to describe things that don't fall into these other categories. So like you can think like simulations, you can think like physics type things. And you can probably see that like the arrows flow into both rule structures and then they also flow into element of chance. And that's because like rule structures and element of chance have kind of like a symbiotic relationship going on where like you have the rule structure, which is like the boundaries that your system needs to operate in, and all the like variance you see that occurs within the boundaries is really occurring due to the element of chance. And so after I like do my spiel about generative art, people are always like, okay, so why do you do generative art? Like, why is this something you fell into? And it's really interesting because I started out in generative art by making data visualizations. And I was making a lot of data visualizations that were starting to like skew into data art for fun. Like I would always joke, like the more incomprehensible it was, the more I was really into it. But the thing that happens a lot with data visualizations is I would have like this idea, like I really want to make a visualization that looks like this. And when you get your data and you start making the data visualization, very often you scrap ideas that you have left and right because it's less about the idea and more about what is the story that you're trying to tell. And because of that, I like sometimes found data visualizations really frustrating because like I wanted to make something that looks like this. I didn't really care about what the data was trying to tell. And that's why generative art makes more sense to me as something that I enjoy doing because you fit the data to the idea, not the idea to the data. And so these two are technically the first like semi-generative art pieces I made. And both of them are from the RStats scene I made before, where like both of them are incorporating like chance into rule structures in a way. And it got me really excited thinking about like people look at this and be like, what is this trying to say? And it's like, nothing, it's pretty. And I loved it. And I like just like dove right in. But then the next question I often get is like, all right, like generative art, like in R, and you are very right to question that. If you Google generative art, almost all of the like artists you find are doing it in P5 or processing. And both of these are JavaScript libraries that are like created in order to like create art and create visualizations and stuff like that. And they're really cool because they allow your stuff to like live and interact in the browser. So it really allows like interactivity and things like that. But I do think like, I'm not saying don't use P5 or processing, because I think they're really cool and they are very important. But I do think you can like start in R and have like a good time creating art in R. And I think it's also like a really good like first step when creating generative art, because it really relies on like, you're able to create generative art in R relying on skills that you already have. And so this is the like data analysis workflow. And if you've read R for data science, you've seen this before, where the idea is like you have your program, you import and you tidy your data, you iterate through transforming, visualizing and modeling over and over again until you like understand, have your results, and then you communicate your results broadly. So these are skills that as people who use R, as people who do like a lot of data analysis or data science or whatever in R, we like know and are deeply familiar with the skills required to like go through this workflow. But you can take these skills and use them in generative art. So instead of importing and tidying your data, you create your data and then you transform it, you visualize it, you manipulate it, you look at the output, you go, walk away, come back. No, I didn't like that. Transform, visualize, iterate over and over again. And then if you're me, you then share it on Twitter as your communication. And so that's why I think like if you want to make generative art in R as R users, like it feels weird at first because you're like, this isn't a data visualization, like what is happening here? But it really does rely on skills that you already have. Okay, cool. So for the rest of the talk, we're going to keep talking about generative art, but I think the best way to like truly understand generative art is by like going through some actual outputs. And so these are two outputs from a system I created for this talk. And on the left is the output from seed 1959, and on the right is from seed 237. And so truly the only difference between these two when I ran my generative art system is that I changed the seed. These are absolutely random numbers. They're not significant to me at all. I actually have a personal rule that like I only like seeds that are multiples of 5. And so both of these break that rule, but this is what happens. And a key thing about generative art is that when you change the seed, the output should change a little bit. Like depending on what you include in your system, there can only be so much variety. And so like with trying enough seeds, you would probably eventually get what you see on the left again in the system. I didn't make it overly complex, but that is one of the things about generative art where it's like, if you run the same script over and over again and your output is the same each time, it's really not generative art. It should be like slightly different. You should be somewhat surprised, I think, when you see your outputs. All right, so going back to like the 3 things I talked about that compose generative art, which is like the autonomous system, R, then there's the rule structures and the element of chance. We're going to start with the rule structures. And before I deep dive into the rule structures, I want to talk about the underlying structure of the system. And why I want to talk about that is because this is how I approach every single thing I make, where it's like, what is the underlying structure? What is the underlying data that I'm starting with that I build on top of? Sometimes I like move them in certain ways. Sometimes it's the same exact thing and things get filled in. But this is the underlying structure. And this is what I talk about when I say like, I do a lot of grid-based art. Everything starts with a grid very similar to what you're seeing on the right. And then for the system, there's actually like more rules in this, but some of them are like itty bitty that I don't really want to like get into and like purely are for like taste reasons. But the biggest ones that are driving it are, I wanted a grid with squares of various sizes. So you can see that there's like a large square here, like medium squares here, and small squares here. Each square had to have lines of different orientation, and the orientation was either vertical, horizontal, or diagonal. And there was two different diagonals. There's this one, and then there's this one. And then the square could not have overlapping colors. And what I mean by that is that the background of the square and then the line color needed to not be the same color. I wanted this to be like not necessarily a monochromatic piece, but like not a like multi tons of color piece. So there's always only two colors. And so one color can be the background, one color could be the lines, but it can never be the same color in the square so that you always see the lines. And what I always do is I take the rules and then I convert them into like functions. And so just as a FYI that I was supposed to say earlier, I'm saying now, is trying to keep the super high level. So all of the code is going to be like pseudocode, trying to like get at like what it's doing versus like, how did I exactly code this? So just as an FYI. And so for the rules I talked about before, the three main functions for that is like subdivide grid, which takes the like grid I showed you before, the like evenly spaced XY coordinates, and it turns it into an irregular grid. So instead of like the super evenly spaced, it's like, okay, there's going to be some smaller squares there. There's going to be some larger squares. There's going to be some medium squares. And then there's the hatch lines functions, which takes the XY coordinates of the irregular grids and fills them in with the lines. And then there's the select colors that goes through all the like XY coordinates up to like squares for the irregular grid. And then it goes like, this one has this color and this one has this fill. And so here's a subdivide grid next to the picture, but like there's something missing here where I'm telling you that like, okay, it's going through and it's deciding like, okay, it's going to like make each point in the grid a different like size square, but how is it choosing which XY coordinate to turn into a small or medium or large square? And that gets left up to the element of chance. And to me, I think this is the most exciting thing about generative art when I make it, is that I always give away a level of control to the generative system. Like I am not making a purely deterministic system. There's like some level of probability always happening here that's changing what the output is. And what I left up to like chance or randomness, or I gave away control for, were color. So you can see that like on the left is like a black and beige palette. It actually might be a very dark gray, knowing me, a very dark gray and beige palette. On the right is like a dark green and a light green. The placement of smaller squares was also like I gave away control for. So you can see that like the distribution and like where squares are placed between these two do not perfectly align. And then also the placement of the lines, like which squares get vertical lines, which squares get horizontal lines, and so forth, was, again, I like kind of gave away control for that. Somewhat left it up to chance. And with all these elements of like what I left to chance, the way that I like incorporated chance into my system was via weighted random sampling and via noise algorithms. So both color and the placement of smaller squares relied on weighted random sampling, and color and the hatch lines also relied on noise algorithms, which I'll explain more in a bit. So what is weighted random sampling? So essentially it's like you take random samples and you take probability weights and you get weighted random sampling for probabilistic aesthetics. I got like introduced to the idea of like probabilistic aesthetics through like another generative artist. I read a lot of like when people do a huge system, they often do write-ups about like what was the thought process. And there's this one artist that says like he always uses probabilistic color palettes. And what he means by that is like you have an aesthetic, so you have your color palette, maybe you have the size of things, and you give like features in the like aesthetic. So if it was a color palette, the features would be like different colors. and you give them different probabilities of occurring. So you want something to occur more, you give it a higher probability. Say you want something to occur less, you give it a lower probability. And so I incorporated that into the placement of smaller squares, where essentially I had a vector where it's like, all right, there's large squares, there's medium squares, there's small squares, and like what that means, like I incorporated like, there's some math, whatever. And then what I decided is I want the largest squares to happen the most often. So let's give it a probability of 0.75. And I want the smaller squares and the medium squares to happen a lot less often, but have equal probability of happening. So I both gave them 0.25 and 0.25. A really cool thing about using sample for weighted random sampling when you're choosing features for your system in R is that it doesn't require the probability to equal 1. And so I really never care about that at all. I'm always like, what do I want to have happen more? What do I want to have happen less? And I just like up some, lower some until like I feel like, okay, I'm really liking the distribution of these features and the outputs. A lot of when I'm building, it's like I look at a ton of outputs and I go like, why do I hate that? And like take notes and then like tweak the system. The selection of color also use weighted random sampling, and like how it kind of worked is I have like color palettes. I could have multiple color palettes, but this time I only have like one color palette, and then the color palette has a ton of hex codes in it that I feel like kind of work well together. But there's some colors that I want to again have a higher occurrence of showing, and that tends to be like in this system, it tended to be like lighter colors. Like I really wanted to make sure that like usually there's like maybe a balance of like lighter and darker colors happening. And then I passed it to sample, which was like pass the hex codes and then pass the associated probabilities with all of them. And then it chose 2 colors that would go into the palette. So that's how I selected colors for the palette. But how I actually placed them is I used a noise algorithm. And first, before I explain like how I use the noise algorithm, I should explain what is noise. So noise. It's kind of hard to explain noise because it's like, it really is just like what you hear, like noise is like, it's noise. But what I decided is like my simple definition of like noise within generative art, it's that, or noise is actually used outside of generative art too. It's used a lot in like computer graphics and stuff like that. But the simple definition is it's a way of incorporating the visual appearance of movement into a static piece. My more complex definition, but I still think it's like simpler than what's actually happening. It's an incorporation of fluctuations in the data. And these fluctuations are often in the form of multidimensional patterns or like mathematical functions. So here's an example of me incorporating noise using like a mathematical function. Yes. So here on the left is the original grid distribution. And then for each point, grid distribution, grid structure, and for each point in the grid structure, so for each XY coordinate, I randomly sampled from a uniform distribution. So I use like RUnif in R. And you can see that like, actually before I say that, and then I created essentially a vector of like, all right, if we moved the point by what the sample was from the uniform distribution, here's what it would look like, these like vector arrows, right? And what you can see is like, it's random. There's like really no rhyme or reason. And while using like complete randomness can be nice, I really like using instead, actually, what is the best way for me even phrasing this? I struggled with this slide so much. I don't actually like, I like for things to appear random, but for them to not actually be random most of the time. Because it's more visually appealing to the eye. And it'll make a bit more sense in the next slide, where I use noise by using a procedural noise generator. And this one is from one of the most popular ones that people use, which is Perlin noise, made by Ken Perlin. And why I really like using a procedural generator for noise versus just using like pure randomness, even though it's not very much pure randomness because all the like random sampling stuff in R use like pseudo random number generators, but whatever, let's not get into that. But why I really like it is that there's a pattern happening here. Like it feels random, but if you look at it for a bit, there's a pattern happening here where it's like this value is being altered very similarly to this value. There tends to be like value, XY coordinates that are closer to each other tend to be modified in a value similarly to other ones surrounding it. And I think that looks more interesting to that because there's a pattern happening, even if you can't pick out the pattern immediately, it just feels more like controlled chaos to me, which I like. And procedural noise generators are really often used to incorporate, like I said in my simple definition, like the feeling of movement. Even though both of these pieces are incredibly static, they're pictures, you feel the movement in the piece. So on the left is Incursions, and this was also created in R by Danielle Navarro. This is like, I think my favorite piece from her watercolor series. And then on the right is a noise study, which I also really, really love. Noise study number 161 by Jackie Tran. And both of these, like, they feel like movements happening, but I'm kind of a contrarian and I almost never use noise to implement the feeling of movement, but I use it for clustering similar values together. And I'll make a bit more sense when I go here, where for the placement of color, I generated a vector of noise using, from the ambient package, I use gen waves. So it like creates noise in concentric circles, which I think is really cool. And so it returns a vector of noise values for each XY coordinate provided in the grid. And what I do is I map the noise values to color options. And so these are not the actual mappings, but as an example, like I can say like 0 to 1 is black beige, 1 to 2 is a black background with beige lines, but 2 to 3 is like a beige background and black lines. And because I'm mapping the noise values to color, it's causing the noise appearance to happen in an unexpected way. So you know how I said this use waves, which is concentric circles? So there's actually concentric circles happening in this grid, but it's not obvious. So this is one circle, which is the black background with beige lines. This is another circle with the beige background with black lines. And this is another circle, and this is another circle. So like, it feels like it's like the color is completely random, but there's actually a pattern happening here, but it's not obvious because it's an irregular grid. But I think it looks so much nicer to the eyes. It's not obviously waves, which I love that it's not obviously waves, but it's like, it is happening here. It's clumping areas that are near each other together and putting them as not similar, but the same color combination. I also used the same noise algorithm and the same vector and map it to lines where like certain range of values of the noise value map to specific lines. And that's why you're seeing like these two are the same distribution, not the same distribution, the same orientation of line, because it's like this grid thing, not this grid thing, this concentric circle thing happening again. And so again, I think noise just looks better than pure randomness because again, there's like an underlying pattern happening, which I think is just a bit more appealing. So I flew through that, but that's essentially like what went into the generative art system. So like a quick summary, like what is generative art, or the elements of generative art that I talked about and how it led to this piece. So again, autonomous system, I used an R script. Then there's the rule structures, and my rules again were the grids with different size squares, the different orientation of lines and non-overlapping colors. but then the element of chance using weighted random sampling and using noise algorithms control the placement of color in the hatch lines and where the smaller squares occurred. And then for fun, I showed, because I really like these two outputs, they're just very pink. And I was like, wow, this is a good combo. To show again, like same system, like same like rules, but just like a different combination of the probability when it came to like the weighted random sampling of colors and squares, but also the like distribution, the placement of things via the noise algorithm, which does like change the values slightly each time, cause these two different outputs that feel like they're in the same family, but they do look different. So cool, where you can find me, I'm on Twitter at ujmaka_a. I'm technically supposed to be on, not a Twitter break, but I'm supposed to be using it less. I'm trying to do 1 week on, 1 week off. It's not going perfectly well, but I'm trying my best, but you can find me on there. And then my portfolio is at my website, ujmaka.art. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ijamaka. That was so interesting to kind of get that deeper dive. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it in. One that came up kind of early, and it was actually before you did kind of the deeper dive into what noise, what do you mean by noise? What are noise functions, all that. But there was a question about like blurring versus noise. And I think most of us are familiar with like, I choose the blur filter and I put it right here, and like maybe like an image editing kind of thing. Have you thought about some of this? I think you answered when you went into a lot of detail about what noise was, but can you maybe speak a little bit about when someone uses the word like I blurred it or I blurred or some way, in what way is that the same or different when you use noise in like
Yeah.
mathematical noise in your art?
So for me, when I think more blurring, it's just kind of like really just like almost like smearing the piece, like just randomly causing like movements in it that like makes the something that is very defined seem more dispersed. And to me, that feels almost more like random, while noise to me is intentional. There are procedural generators that some of them are based off of like pseudo random number generators and some of them are not, but they're actually very pattern based, the way that it's creating values. The waves one does concentric circles. The Perlin one does like almost like this like cloud shape, if you've ever seen that. And so there's a bit more intention. And then with blurring, the end result is always like it looks more blurry. But noise can be used in so many different ways to change the effect of like what it is. It's almost like a way of like just like incorporating controlled or patterned randomness that you can use for like moving things, like moving particles, and like in simulations, you can also use it for like the two pieces I showed where like incorporating the feeling of movement. You can use it the way I did, which is like controlling the placement of things. So like similar things are near each other. And so noise can like just be used for multiple different outcomes. And that's what I think the difference is.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. There's another question here about the example of fractal art, like building fractal art, and a question about like how are these things related? Do you think like what would you say is like one a subset of the other? Is it like a specific application? What have you ever been interested in fractal art? Like what do you think about those two and how they are related?
So I think they are overlapping very often. You see a lot of people use fractals sometimes within generative art. So like you start with like a pattern and then you use fractals. Like you use generative art to create like a random pattern, right? Like create a pattern that using your system, and then you use fractals to then like have that pattern be repeated throughout the piece in specific ways. But do I think like fractal art is like purely generative art at its core? Not really. But I think you can use the elements from fractals within generative art. I don't make them fairly often because it just requires so much trig, to be honest. I my math skills have like tremendously improved through doing generative art because like don't let anyone lie to you, it's all math, like it's just nonstop math. but I'm not gonna go that far, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So someone wanted to ask about the radial examples you showed at near the
Mhm,
beginning for your zine, and maybe while you're talking, I can try to find a link and drop it because it is so cool, that whole
mhm,
zine. But what can you maybe say a little bit about the system? You told us in detail kind of about this grid system,
mhm.
and so this person asked actually specifically about the one on the right here,
Okay.
the pattern 31. They
Mhm.
were saying like, is it possible to kind of briefly explain how that was created?
Yeah.
Um, and like, just to give people an idea of like, oh, a different kind of system, how it might work.
Yeah. So this one, I am 99% sure was done in a Cartesian coordinate system and not a polar coordinate system. Doing things in a polar coordinate system is a really easy way to cheat into turning lines into circles without having to involve trigonometry. But I'm like 99% sure I did not do that on this one. And kind of what happened was like, in order to create a dispersed circle, I wish I could remember the trick of it. There's,
I think you have some of it in the code, if I remember right.
yeah. So you
Yeah.
create a vector from 0 to 2 pi, and and then to make things into a circle, the x is the sine of that vector and the y is the cos of that vector, and so that'll just make a pure circle. But then as you want the circle to go farther out, right, you need to increase the radius of the circle. And what I did was I had a ton of points at the closest radius, which is like this smaller circle. And then as it goes farther and farther out, I think I randomly sampled and removed points so that it became more and more dispersed as you go from the like center of the circle and outwards. And that's why this one is like somewhat generative, because it was the creation of it, which is like these tightly packed points, is very deterministic, but the piece does look slightly different each time because of it's not always removing the same points as it goes out, as you travel out from like the smallest radius to the largest radius. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So one question I had, and you alluded to this a bit, is about you do this partly because of it brings you joy, you're creative.
Mhm.
But you did talk about like, oh, I have learned this skill, or this part of what I do has improved. What do you think? Can you give maybe an example of something that you like, this does not transfer at all, I just do it because I love it? Or and then maybe is there an example of something that has transferred like to your other
Mhm.
kind of coding work that you're like, I am better at X now because of my work in this?
I so much of generative art is like kind of like repeating the same thing over and over again. So you take a function, you have a grid, and then it's like iterating through the grid. If you rely on for loops for all of this, you're gonna crash your R. And so I've become very good at per now because like it is so much faster. I've become very good at like taking something that is going to be like a piece and wrapping it in a function, and also like building the function in a way that I can like take a technique that I created from one piece and transfer it to a completely different piece by using that function. So it's really helped me with like my like function development skills. It's really helped me with like, what do you call like using per, like is it
Yeah,
just like
functional
yeah,
programming. Yeah.
functional programming. Like those have transferred, like those have like greatly improved my programming skills. What is not transferable, really, it's the math.
Right? Because we really don't do a lot of that with data analysis.
Yeah, I like, all this trig in my head has not
Yeah.
helped me in my job whatsoever. I also like sometimes catch myself trying to implement something. I'm like, okay, like I really want to do this, but like I don't really understand how this works. And then I'll end up Googling things and like reading the weirdest papers that don't help me anywhere. Where like I was trying to like find the best way to like iteratively create a shape that would look like an avocado. And so I ended up in like this computer design, like simulation paper where they were talking about how they like built the shape of avocados and then do this simulation where they're like shaking avocados, right? So that they're able to like best predict in like shipping avocados, how bruised will the avocado show up? I read that whole paper. And I was like, why did I read this? It was helpful. It was very helpful for creating an avocado shape, but I'm just like one project I used
Yeah,
it in
right.
and
Yeah,
never
yeah,
used it
yeah,
again. And
yeah.
so I think that it's really like the math. You like learn weird math things. Weird isn't the right thing. It's just like math things that are not at all the industry that I'm in work wise, and not at all the industry I'm trying to be in.
Yeah.
But it's kind of what you need in order to like sometimes create more complex pieces. So the math does not transfer at all, but the programming transfers quite a bit.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So one other question I have, so if anybody else has a question, feel free to, drop it in here, is that so in the process of getting better, getting better at this or, learning new things or whatever, what would you say has been the value or the balance in like just trying stuff yourself and like I'm just gonna try a bunch of stuff versus maybe going to other people's explanations of how they built systems,
Mhm.
doing reading. So what do you feel like you've learned from those two approaches? Is one like way more important to you than the other? What do you think?
Both are very important. I think um, very often when people do write-ups about like their approach to a generous system, it's no code. It's no code at all. It's like they're thinking. And I think that's really great because then you're able to take what they do and say they're doing it in JavaScript. I'm able to like translate it into R because they're not showing the code. They're like, this is how I approach this. Like, here's high level, like how this would work in like when I'm like doing things. And that's how I've been able to like learn a lot of techniques, just being like, oh, okay, that's how you do it. If I was going to do it in R, this is how I would implement it. Um, I also think reading reading has also really like inspired me to sometimes be like, oh, I wouldn't think to approach something that way. Like, let me try that. And also things I'm like, I didn't even know that was like a possible thing to do. Often, sometimes with like tricks. Like, that's how I learned about like using noise to place things rather than using noise to like cause movement. Was a piece I really liked, someone did a write up of how they created it. And they were like, oh, I use this for and it was such a throwaway sentence. And I was like, what? That's so smart. And yeah, and it was great. So yeah, that's
Yeah, so both really.
yeah, it's really both because
Yeah.
then because you like read and then you try things. Also sometimes I just like won't read anything. I'm like, I saw a picture of something and I think that picture looks really cool. And I'm trying, how would I try to like recreate this like pattern I saw outside or this like other phenomenon I saw outside? And sometimes I don't get there and sometimes I do get there. And either way, it's still like fun.
Yeah, nice. All right. Well, I think that's most of everyone's questions. Some of them we answered in the chat with links to resources and whatnot. So I want to say thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
Nijamaka, thank you so much for your time here. And so next month in September, we're having another meeting. This one has a different focus than what we were doing today, but I think it'll be super interesting. I'm like looking forward to it because it's something that I have had this idea of is about logistic regression and how to talk about it with like business stakeholders or like less technical people. And that's something that I feel like I've had to do multiple times and like would love to hear more about. So definitely look for that. Come and join